You know, usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, like it's supposed to be engineering.
Exactly. You fall off a bike, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right across the bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, you know, there it is, that's the problem.
Yeah, it's binary, it's clean.
Broken or not broken, you put a cast on it, 6 weeks later, you're totally fine.
And, I mean, it's comforting, right? Human beings love when things are visible. We love to be able to categorize the world into these neat, solvable boxes.
We really do. But then you step out of that orthopedics clinic and into the world of, say, neurodevelopment.
Yeah.
Or complex trauma.
Oh, yeah. Totally different ballgame.
Right. Suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is honestly completely murky. You can't just point at a brain scan and find the exact pixel where generational trauma lives.
No, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You are no longer dealing with a simple physical fracture. You're dealing with, like, invisible forces, layered histories.
Deeply ingrained subconscious narratives.
Exactly.
And today, we are taking that exact metaphor, that shift from a clean, binary reality into incredibly murky, complex waters, and we are applying it directly to the geopolitical map.
Because what we're looking at today is the intersection of the sacred and the political.
It really is. We're going to explore how ancient esoteric doctrines, highly complex mystical interpretations, and, you know, historical religious polemics aren't just sitting quietly in museums.
Or gathering dust in theological libraries.
Yeah. They are actively shaping modern geopolitical conflicts, shifting national borders, and dictating societal structures right now.
It's an incredibly fascinating mission. We're going to trace the through line from what seems like an incredibly obscure single ancient requirement.
Like the excessive search for a perfectly red cow.
Yes. Or the mystical interpretation of a single letter in the Hebrew alphabet. We're tracing that all the way to modern military conscription, underground terror plots, and, well, the fundamental ways entirely different groups of people construct their reality.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the stakes honestly could not be higher. We are dealing with living, breathing blueprints that people are actively using to build entirely different, often mutually exclusive versions of reality.
Right.
But before we step into this, we need to address the elephant in the room with you, the listener, because today we are stepping into a geopolitical and theological minefield.
A massive one.
We are looking at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the modern state of Israel, the Palestinian people, and deeply, deeply ingrained theological divides.
It is arguably the most intensely debated and fiercely contested ideological territory on Earth.
It is. So let me be crystal clear here. We are acting purely as your guides through these blueprints.
They're partial guides.
Completely impartial. We are not taking a side. We are endorsing no viewpoints, no political platforms, no military strategies, and absolutely no religious doctrines.
Our only goal today is to impartially unpack the fascinating history and the powerful ideologies presented in our stack of research.
Exactly. We want to understand how these beliefs function and why they drive people to do what they do. Think of us as like structural engineers looking at the blueprints of belief, just trying to see how the building stays standing.
I like that. We're examining the architecture of belief and how that architecture translates into physical, real-world action. Because when you understand the architecture, behaviors that seem completely irrational from the outside suddenly follow a very strict, undeniable internal logic.
Right. So keeping that purely analytical, structural lens firmly in place, I want to start with a cow.
A very specific, historically weighted cow.
Yes. Let's look at the visceral, modern-day reality of the red heifer, because when I was going through the research, I genuinely had to stop and reread this several times.
It feels anachronistic, doesn't it?
Yeah. It sounds like it belongs in the book of Leviticus, not in a modern news cycle. But, okay, on July 1st, 2025, an event took place that bridged thousands of years of history. A red heifer, which was actually brought all the way from Texas to Israel.
By an organization called Boni Israel.
Right. So this cow from Texas was prepared and burned on a massive wood pyre in Samaria. And it was officiated by a Cohen, a priest descended directly from the biblical Aaron.
The visual of that is just staggering when you really think about it.
It's wild.
To understand why a cow from Texas was flown across the world, treated with the utmost reverence, and then burned on a pyre in the 21st century, we have to look at the biblical law outlined in the book of Numbers.
Specifically chapter 19, right?
Yes, chapter 19. The requirement for this ritual is incredibly, almost impossibly stringent. The heifer must be pure red. And when they say pure red, they mean it.
Like completely red.
Entirely. If it has even 2 hairs of another color, black, white, brown, it is entirely disqualified.
Wow. 2 hairs?
Just 2 hairs. And it must be completely unblemished, meaning it can never have been used for work. It can never have worn a yoke.
Okay.
And its ashes, when mixed with spring water, are the essential non-negotiable ingredient required to purify the priests and the altars for the temple service.
So what does this actually mean in a modern context? Like, why does anyone care about purifying priests today?
Well, it means that if you want to rebuild the third temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Which is currently the site of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Exactly. 2 of the holiest sites in Islam. If you want to rebuild a Jewish temple there, you theoretically cannot do it. Or, more accurately, you cannot properly consecrate the priests to serve in that temple without the ashes of a perfectly red heifer.
So the cow is essentially the ignition key.
It is. Yeah.
Without the cow, the engine of the third temple cannot start.
That is the crux of the issue. The red heifer is the absolute prerequisite for the temple. And the temple is the prerequisite in many highly influential theological frameworks for the ultimate redemption of the world.
Bringing the Messiah.
Right. The coming of the Messiah and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly incredibly tense. This highly anticipated July 2025 sacrifice, it ultimately didn't count.
It didn't. The Temple Institute, which is the primary organization based in Jerusalem, dedicated to preparing all the vessels and garments for the third temple, they officially disqualified the sacrifice.
Wait, after flying it all the way from Texas, keeping it under 24/7 surveillance and going through the entire pyre ceremony, they just said, never mind.
Yeah, they did. The internal texts and subsequent statements from the organization reveal that, upon intense inspection, they admitted the heifer actually had non-red hairs.
Oh man, the 2 hairs rule.
Yep. But there's an even deeper, much more profound theological layer to this disqualification than just a couple of stray white hairs. They cited a tradition passed down from the great medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides.
Maimonides. I feel like we see his name everywhere in this research.
We do, yes. The Rambam. He is a foundational pillar of Jewish legal and philosophical thought. And Maimonides codified a tradition stating that only 9 red heifers have been successfully prepared in all of human history.
Stretching all the way back to Moses.
All the way back.
Hold on. Only 9, ever, in thousands of years.
Ever. And Maimonides wrote a rather enigmatic, incredibly weighty statement. He said that the 10th red heifer will be prepared by the Messiah.
Okay, let that sink in for a second. So, by disqualifying this heifer, the Temple Institute is wrestling with an unbelievable theological weight.
Massive weight.
Because if they say, yes, this cow is perfect, we have successfully prepared the 10th heifer, they are essentially putting a flag in the ground and declaring the Messianic era is here right now, and we are initiating it.
Exactly. The theological pressure is immense. The 10th cow is the point of no return in that specific eschatological worldview.
But what blew my mind in the research is that this expectation, this obsessive focus on finding the perfect red cow, isn't just limited to Jewish tradition. The evidence on the ground shows there is a massive, incredibly well-funded Christian Zionist interest in this exact same cow from Texas.
Precisely. And this is where the geopolitical tension really ratchets up and becomes deeply layered. From a traditional Orthodox Christian theological perspective, based on the New Testament, specifically the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, permanently replaced the need for the ashes of a heifer.
Right.
The text there explicitly argues that if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer could theoretically purify the flesh, how much more does the blood of Christ cleanse the conscience? It was viewed as a one-time final fulfillment.
So if I'm tracking the theology correctly, Christians theoretically shouldn't care about a red cow at all. It should be obsolete.
Theoretically, yes. But for Christian Zionists, who represent a powerful political and financial bloc, especially in the United States, the reinstitution of animal sacrifices in Jerusalem is a crucial prophetic milestone.
So it's a completely different goal.
Totally different. It's not about achieving spiritual purification. It's about a countdown clock. According to their specific reading of biblical prophecy, primarily the book of Daniel, chapter 12, the halting of daily sacrifices in a rebuilt temple is tied to an event called the Great Tribulation.
Okay.
Furthermore, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, there is the expectation of an antichrist figure, a man of sin, who will be revealed by sitting in that rebuilt temple.
Let me just pause you there to make sure I am fully grasping the dynamic here. You have one group, The Temple Institute and their supporters trying to find the cow to build the temple, to bring the Messiah and usher in an era of global peace.
Right.
Then you have another group, Christian Zionists, funding and supporting the search for the exact same cow because they believe building the temple will trigger a global tribulation, an antichrist, and the apocalyptic end of the world.
That is the documented reality of the alliance, yes. They are looking at the exact same biological animal, standing in the exact same field, but they are projecting two completely different world-ending eschatological visions onto it.
It's like finding a biological key that unlocks a geopolitical powder keg. I mean, why does a single biological anomaly, a cow, with the right genetics, hold the power to potentially ignite a global conflict?
Because of where that temple has to be built. We cannot overstate this. The Temple Mount is perhaps the most fiercely contested, spiritually volatile piece of real estate on the planet.
Yeah.
Any attempt to change the status quo there, let alone actually clear the site to build a massive third temple, would trigger immediate, massive, and likely violent geopolitical fallout across the entire Islamic world.
And subsequently draw in global superpowers.
Without a doubt.
Which brings up a really fascinating point raised in some of the modern prophetic analysis we looked at. Following the failure of the 2025 sacrifice, the Temple Institute seemed to shift their strategy. They moved toward a policy of secrecy. They openly admitted they are now keeping their agricultural efforts hidden.
Yes, this is a profound shift toward what we might call institutional opacity. When a group that is actively trying to fulfill a highly public, world-altering prophecy suddenly goes underground, it changes the dynamic entirely.
It really does.
It removes the public scrutiny, but it also creates a vacuum where speculation runs wild. Some analysts, looking at this from a Christian prophetic perspective, have speculated that the repeated failure to produce a qualified red heifer might actually be a quiet mercy.
A quiet mercy. That is a beautiful, heavy phrase. What does that mean?
It's the idea of a divine delay. The theological logic goes like this. If finding the heifer triggers the building of a temple, and building the temple inevitably triggers global chaos, holy war, and the rise of deception, then the inability to find a cow without 3 white hairs isn't a failure of agriculture. It is actually God hitting the pause button on the apocalypse. It's a quiet mercy to a world that isn't ready.
Wow. That is a stunning reframing. It turns a failed livestock experiment into a moment of profound divine grace.
Exactly.
But let's push on that idea of going underground to fulfill prophecy, because the search for the red heifer is ultimately about the Temple Mount. And when you look at the events of recent history, the desire to control that specific sacred space has led to actual documented covert extremism.
It absolutely has. Theology doesn't always wait patiently. Sometimes it forces the issue, which leads us perfectly into the events of the 1980s and the formation of a group that became known as the Jewish Underground.
Let's unpack the Jewish Underground, because the context here is crucial. The records show this group formed in the early 80s in response to a series of terror events against Jewish settlers in the West Bank. The atmosphere at the time was thick with tension. There was a profound feeling of political impotence among certain ideological groups, a feeling that the secular Israeli government's response to violence was too moderate, too compromising.
And this is a recurring historical pattern. When a deeply ideological or religious group feels that the secular political apparatus is failing them, when they feel that the government is operating on pragmatic politics rather than divine mandate, they often turn to theological solutions.
They take matters into their own hands.
They do. The Underground perpetrated several acts of reprisal against Palestinian mayors and institutions. But the most staggering, ambitious plot they conceived was led by 2 specific figures, a Kabbalist named Yeshua ben Shushan and an ideologue named Yehuda Etzion.
And their plot was to literally blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount.
Yes. But to truly understand this, you have to look past the physical act of terrorism. If you view this merely as a turf war, you miss the entire psychological and spiritual engine driving it. You have to understand the radical Kabbalistic interpretation that Ben Shushan and Etzion were operating under. This wasn't just about destroying a building to claim territory for a state. This was a theurgical plan.
Theurgical. Let's break that word down for the listener. What is theurgy?
Theurgy is a deeply esoteric concept. It is the belief that human actions, specific rituals, prayers, or in this case, physical destruction, can directly influence, manipulate, or compel the divine realm to act.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The underground believed that Islamic control of the Temple Mount was not just an unfortunate political reality or a historical problem. They viewed it as an ongoing, active cosmic catastrophe. In their specific Kabbalistic framework, the Islamic sanctuaries on the Mount were literally feeding the Kilipah.
Okay, the kilipot, that roughly translates to husks or shells. Yep.
Exactly. In Jewish mysticism, the Kilipot represent the forces of evil, impurity, or obstruction that surround and trap the divine light. The underground's interpretation was that Islam's physical, architectural control of the sacred space of the Temple Mount was actively drawing spiritual power from it.
So they thought.
They believed these mosques were functioning like massive spiritual batteries, strengthening the Khalifa, and by extension, strengthening Palestinian control over the physical land of Israel.
So wait, are we saying they viewed a physical explosion as a spiritual mechanism? Like, it's not just a bomb to cause terror, it's like cutting a spiritual fiber optic cable to drain their enemy's power source.
That is a highly accurate analogy. They viewed the destruction of the mosques as an iteruta dilatata.
Another massive concept. Explain iteruta dilatata.
It's an Aramaic term from Kabbalistic literature that translates to an awakening from below. The core concept is that sometimes the heavens are closed, the divine flow of redemption is blocked, and God is essentially waiting for humanity to make a drastic, tangible, physical move on earth.
An awakening from below.
Exactly. To break the deadlock and force a divine response, which is called an awakening from above. By physically destroying the mosques, they believed they would shatter the Khalifa, clear the spiritual blockage, force God's hand, and forcefully hasten the ultimate messianic redemption.
But what is absolutely gripping about this is that the internal texts and testimonies from the subsequent trials revealed there was a massive, fundamental debate between the leaders about how exactly to execute this awakening. And the details of this debate show just how intensely mystical their worldview was.
The friction between Ben Shushan and Etzion perfectly captures the tension between pure theoretical mysticism and practical militant extremism. According to the documented testimonies, after Ben Shushan was eventually arrested and interrogated, he mused that perhaps their plan was flawed in its execution. He suggested that maybe they shouldn't have planned to actually detonate the explosives.
Let me stop you. The plan was to acquire explosives, sneak onto the most heavily guarded, politically sensitive holy site in the world, wire the Temple Mount with dynamite, and then just leave it there, without pushing the button.
Yes. His idea, his purely mystical logic, was that they just needed to lay the explosives and connect the wires to show God their absolute, unwavering intention. They would do their bit.
Wow.
They would provide the physical infrastructure for the awakening from below, and then leave the actual detonation up to divine intervention, a lightning strike, or fate. The intention was the action.
And how did Etzion, his co-conspirator, react to that idea?
Etzion was completely shocked and appalled by it. The idea of going through all that risk, penetrating the security, setting the charges, and then walking away without setting off the explosion was incomprehensible to him. Etzion was operating on a much more literal, militant interpretation. For him, forcing the redemption meant actually pulling the trigger.
I have to push back here because grasping the emotional and psychological mechanics of this belief is so incredibly difficult for anyone operating from a secular, Western mindset. How can physical destruction, smuggling dynamite, and blasting caps into a holy site where people pray be justified in their minds as a purely spiritual necessity? How do you get from God is pure light, love, and redemption to we need to blow up a functioning mosque to free that light?
To understand it, you have to step into a worldview where the physical and the spiritual are entirely, inextricably enmeshed. There is no separation between church and state or heaven and earth in this mindset.
Right.
If you truly, deeply believe that a physical building of another faith is literally acting as a cosmic tumor, actively radiating evil and blocking the salvation of the world, then destroying it isn't viewed as violence against human beings. It's viewed as cosmic surgery. It's excising a cancer to save the patient.
Which is a terrifyingly effective way to completely bypass traditional morality. If you reclassify an act of terror as cosmic surgery, the normal rules of engagement, the Geneva Conventions, basic human empathy, it all just vanishes. You are no longer bound by human laws.
Precisely. And that concept, reclassifying the rules of engagement based on ancient theological categories, leads us directly into the broader examination of how religious texts are interpreted to justify extreme violence, or conversely, absolute unwavering pacifism.
If an underground group can justify dynamite as spiritual surgery, it begs a much larger question. How exactly do you extract the rules of modern warfare from an ancient religious text? We see this playing out today with figures like Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg.
Yes. Let's look at the theology of violence. Yitzhak Ginsburg is a highly prominent, deeply controversial figure known for his neo-Hasidic approach. He operates a yeshiva and has a significant following. And he openly advocates for a Jewish theocracy.
Okay.
He supports dismantling the secular democratic components of the State of Israel and replacing them with a religious kingdom governed strictly by Torah law.
But what brings him into this specific discussion about the rules of engagement is his association with a deeply controversial book compiled by some of his close rabbinic associates called Torat Amalek, or the King's Torah.
Torat Amalek is a major flashpoint. The texts reveal that this book essentially outlines rules of engagement against non-Jews, specifically in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that are derived purely from internal religious law.
Completely ignoring secular military law.
Or international human rights standards, yes. It controversially differentiates fundamentally between the inherent holiness of Jewish and non-Jewish souls. And in certain contexts of war, it condones extreme preemptive violence, even theoretically against children, if they are deemed to grow up and pose a future threat.
How does a religious framework arrive at that point? How do you read a text that says, "Thou shalt not kill," and extrapolate a justification for preemptive strikes on non-combatants?
To understand the theological mechanism that allows for this, you have to look at the eternal ideological concept of Amalek.
Amalek. This is a recurring, deeply heavy theme in the research. We need to unpack this concept thoroughly because it seems to be the linchpin for so much of this ideology.
Amalek was a literal biblical nation. According to the book of Exodus, Amalek attacked the Israelites in the desert immediately after they had miraculously escaped from slavery in Egypt. And the crucial detail in the biblical narrative, the thing that makes Amalek uniquely evil, is that they attacked for no strategic reason.
Right, they didn't want land.
They didn't want resources. And they didn't attack the soldiers at the front. They struck the weak, the sick, and the stragglers at the rear.
It was pure malice. It was violence purely for the sake of violence.
Exactly. It was an attack on the very concept of divine providence and morality. Because of this unprovoked cruelty, the Torah issues a terrifying command to the Israelites to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.
An eternal command of utter annihilation.
Yes. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and Maimonides codified this as an ongoing, active, positive obligation for the Jewish people. But here's the critical shift. The actual genetic nation of Amalek, the people who lived in the desert, disappeared from history thousands of years ago. They are gone.
So if the genetic people are gone, how do you fulfill a divine command to wipe them out? You can't just cross an item off a divine to-do list if the item doesn't exist.
So Amalek transitions. It evolves from a genetic, historical reality into an ideological category. In this worldview, Amalek comes to represent pure, unadulterated opposition to the existence of the Jewish people and the presence of God in the world. Therefore, anyone, any nation, or any modern political group that seeks the destruction of the Jews is immediately labeled as the spiritual heir of Amalek.
And there's a fascinating, almost haunting ritual that illustrates just how deeply this concept is embedded in the daily life of some practitioners. The evidence shows that a sofer, a traditional Torah scribe who handwrites the sacred scrolls, will start his workday with a very specific, visceral practice.
Yes. Before he writes a single holy word, before he writes the name of God, the scribe will take a scrap of parchment. He will write out the Hebrew letters for Amalek, Ayin, Mem, Lamed, Kuf, and then he will take a thick black pen and violently cross those letters out. He is literally physically blotting out the name of Amalek.
Wait, hold on. Every single morning, before he does anything else.
Every morning.
That isn't just a metaphor. That is a physical, daily act of cosmic warfare happening at a desk. It's a daily recommitment to an eternal ideological war. But as one of the source analyses points out, the intention behind that stroke of the pen is everything. Does that thick black line signify an ethical internal rejection of evil and social injustice within oneself? Or does it signify a violent external rejection of the other, of a political enemy?
And this is where it becomes geopolitically dangerous. When the concept of Amalek is applied to a modern political conflict, when an entire population or a political movement is categorized as Amalek, it completely removes the possibility of negotiation, diplomacy, or compromise.
Because you can't compromise with pure evil.
Exactly. You cannot sign a peace treaty with Amalek. You cannot share land with Amalek. The only divine mandate is eradication.
Okay, let's pivot the lens entirely. We've just spent time looking at how theology can construct an airtight architecture for violence and eternal war. Now let's look at how theology, using the exact same premise of a divine creator and an interconnected universe, constructs the architecture for absolute, unwavering pacifism. We look at the Christian pacifism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
The contrast here is profound and essential. King's theology of nonviolence wasn't just a political tactic designed to win civil rights. It wasn't just a strategy for optics. It was rooted in a deep, unshakable, ontological belief about the very nature of the universe.
He used this incredible phrase, a single garment of destiny.
Yes, King believed in the radical mutuality and interdependence of all reality. He argued that all persons are parts of a larger organic whole created by God. Therefore, to use violence against anyone, even your violent oppressor, even the police dogs and the fire hoses, is to fundamentally damage the entire garment. You are ultimately injuring yourself and tearing the fabric of reality itself.
The text notes that King appealed to non-cooperation with evil not just as a political boycott, but as a profound moral duty. He believed that cooperating with an unjust system actually contaminates your soul. You remove yourself from the contagion of evil by refusing to participate in it, even if that refusal brings violence upon you.
And this implies a universe where spiritual energy, specifically self-emptying love, or agape, as pacifist theologians describe it, is as objective, real, and governing as physical laws like gravity. In this view, authorizations for lethal force, even in self-defense, are contrary to the very structure of being itself. Violence is a rejection of God's design.
So here is the ultimate pushback, the friction that makes all of this so difficult to resolve. If you have one ideology that views reality as a shared, interdependent garment where pulling a single thread unravels the whole thing for everyone, and you have another ideology that views reality as a cosmic battlefield where a specific, irredeemable Amalek must be aggressively crossed out with a thick black line, how can these two worldviews ever coexist in a modern, pluralistic, secular society?
It is the defining friction of our age. When you have groups operating on fundamental, deeply held assumptions about reality that are mutually exclusive, secular society completely struggles to find a common language to mediate between them. A diplomat talking about borders and GDP has no vocabulary to address a conflict rooted in the concept of Amalek, or a single garment of destiny.
And it gets even more complicated than that. Because if you're looking at this from the outside, you might assume that deep, traditional religious conviction naturally aligns with state power, especially in a place like Israel, which defines itself as a Jewish state. You'd think the most religious would be the most nationalistic. But the documented history shows us the exact opposite.
Yes, this brings us to one of the most counterintuitive, fascinating phenomena in the region.
Not all deep religious conviction leads to state-sponsored violence or militant territorial expansion. In fact, we have groups using ancient texts to completely forcefully reject the state's military and political authority. So I'm reading about this group, the Neturei Karta, led by figures like Rabbi Yohanan Beck, and I had to read the text twice to make sure I understood it. You have ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Israel who are vehemently against the existence of the state of Israel. How does that theology even work?
Neturei Karta, which translates from Aramaic as guardians of the city, are an ultra-Orthodox group known for their absolute, uncompromising, and highly public rejection of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. They participate in protests, they burn Israeli flags on certain holidays, and they refuse any funding from the state.
To the point where Rabbi Beck openly states that Zionism is a complete denial of Judaism, that they are mutually exclusive.
Which is a deeply jarring statement for many people to hear. But his argument is not political. It is rooted in a very specific, unyielding interpretation of Jewish history and theology. He argues that true Jewish faith requires waiting patiently in exile for the Messiah to arrive and establish a divine, miraculous kingdom. Attempting to force the issue taking history into human hands by creating a secular political apparatus, an army, a modern nation-state, is viewed as an act of profound, arrogant rebellion against God's timeline.
He basically says, believing in a God doesn't mean believing when it's light and everything is great. Believing means when it's dark, when we are in exile, when we are suffering, we are still waiting for God to act. We don't build a state to save ourselves, we wait to be saved.
And this theological stance is heavily based on the writings of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the former Satmar Rebbe, who survived the Holocaust and became a towering figure in the anti-Zionist Orthodox world. Specifically, his foundational, massive work, Vayol Moshe.
Let's get into the mechanics of Teitelbaum's argument, because he builds this entire anti-state theology on something called the Three Oaths.
The Three Oaths are derived from a specific passage in the Talmud tractate Ketubot, commenting on verses from the biblical Song of Songs. According to this ancient tradition, when the Jewish people went into exile, God made them swear 3 cosmic oaths. First, not to ascend to the Holy Land as a wall, meaning they cannot return en masse by military force. Second, not to rebel against the nations of the world among whom they live. And third, God made the nations swear not to oppress Israel too harshly.
So Teitelbaum looks at the founders of the modern state of Israel, the secular Zionists of the 20th century, and says, you broke the oaths.
Exactly. He viewed the creation of a Jewish polity, an army, and a government before the Messianic era as a catastrophic historical transgression. He blamed the breaking of these oaths for much of the suffering of the Jewish people in the 20th century. In fact, he went so far as to equate the modern secular state to the biblical sin of the golden calf.
Oh, wow. The golden calf, the ultimate defining sin of idolatry in the desert right after receiving the 10 Commandments.
Yes. Teitelbaum's argument was devastating in its internal logic. He noted that during the episode of the golden calf, the Israelites actually thought they were worshiping God. They had good intentions. They wanted a physical representation to lead them because Moses was gone. But they were being deceived by a satanic illusion. He argued that Zionism is the modern golden calf. Secular state builders think they are saving the Jewish people, building a safe haven. But Teitelbaum argued they are actually strengthening forces of impurity by abandoning the true passive faith required in exile.
This entire framework relies on a concept called the spirituality of exile, which the texts trace all the way back to the Babylonian exile in 597 BCE.
Right. When the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, the Jewish people were suddenly displaced. Judaism had to radically reinvent itself to survive without its geographic center, without a physical temple for animal sacrifices. Prayer, Torah study, and self-sacrifice became the new mechanisms for atonement. The local synagogue replaced the grand temple. Waiting, enduring, and maintaining purity in a foreign land became a form of active, high-level spiritual service. Groups like Netzrei Karta believe that this state of exile is the explicit divine will until the Messiah arrives, and any human attempt to end it is an act of heresy.
So how does this theology practically play out on the ground today? It's not just theoretical. We see it violently manifesting around the incredibly contentious issue of the IDF draft.
Yes, the conscription of the Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox community, into the Israel Defense Forces.
The documented reality shows massive, sometimes violent protests by Haredi men refusing to be drafted. We see images of them blocking major highways, clashing with police on horseback, chanting that they would rather die than serve. And it's deeply fascinating because it's not simply a pacifist objection to holding a gun. They fear the institution of the military itself.
They view the IDF not just as an army, but as a secular melting pot, deliberately designed by the state to assimilate them into mainstream, secular Israeli society. The entire Haredi way of life is built on insularity, protecting their communities, their children, and their minds from secular influence so they can devote themselves entirely to Torah study and religious observance. Joining the army means leaving that highly protective bubble. It exposes them to secular commanders, mixed-gender environments, and a nationalistic ethos. To them, it's an existential threat to their cultural and religious soul.
But here's where the geopolitical situation becomes absolutely dripping with irony. Our research highlights a completely parallel yet fundamentally opposite phenomenon happening in the exact same region. While the most deeply religious Jews are violently protesting being drafted into the army of the Jewish state, there are Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank who are voluntarily choosing to join the IDF.
It is an incredibly stark, mind-bending contrast. You have members of an occupied population actively choosing to put on the uniform and serve in the military apparatus of the occupying power.
We have to talk about the psychological friction here. Think about what a family dinner looks like for a Palestinian Arab who joins the IDF. The social cost for these volunteers is absolutely massive. They are almost universally viewed as traitors, as collaborators by their own communities. They face ostracization, sometimes violence, and as the texts point out, they don't exactly receive ultimate warm acceptance from the Israeli state or the Jewish soldiers they serve alongside either. They are viewed with suspicion. It's a lose-lose situation materially and socially.
They are essentially stateless actors navigating a highly complex, deeply paranoid security apparatus. Their motivations are varied and complex. Sometimes it's a desire to prove loyalty to the state they live in. Sometimes it's driven by pure economic necessity, a salary, benefits, a way out of poverty. And sometimes it's a genuine, if fraught, desire to assimilate into the dominant power structure to secure a better future for themselves, despite the immense cost.
So I have to ask, You have secular state builders desperate to conscript the most religious Jews who vehemently refuse because of ancient theology. Meanwhile, elements of the occupied Arab population volunteer for the occupying army to assimilate. Does this show that religious internal identity is actually a much stronger, more resilient political force than modern national identity?
It strongly suggests that when national identity, the flag, the state, the anthem, comes into direct conflict with deeply held religious or communal identity, religion almost always wins the loyalty test. The Haredi draft refusers and the Palestinian IDF volunteers both demonstrate that human behavior defies simple, rational, nationalistic logic. It's driven by internal, deeply constructed narratives of who they are and what they must do to survive, whether that survival is defined spiritually in the world to come or physically in the present.
And it all comes down to how these groups are reading, interpreting, and metabolizing their foundational texts. Which brings us to the engine room of all of this. To truly grasp how you get such wildly divergent views, how you get Rabbi Ginsburg justifying violent preemptive strikes on one side and Rabbi Beck demanding absolute anti-Zionist pacifism on the other, both drawing from the exact same ancient religion, you have to look at how they decode reality. You have to look at Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and Gematria.
Yes. We have to open the hood on 20th-century Kabbalah. If you just read the literal words of the Torah, you miss the vast subterranean world of interpretation that drives these movements. The documented texts point us heavily toward the Ashlag circle.
Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag. He essentially reframed ancient, incredibly dense mysticism through a deeply psychological, almost accessible lens.
Ashlag's core premise is elegant, but its implications are profound. He argued that the entire universe, every action, and all of human psychology is a constant battle between two fundamental forces, the desire to receive and the desire to give.
So essentially, egoism versus altruism.
Exactly. The desire to receive for oneself is the human force, rooted in ego, survival, and selfishness. The desire to give, to bestow upon others, is the pure divine force. Ashlag taught that the ultimate purpose of human existence and the true hidden meaning behind observing every single religious commandment is to transform the innate desire to receive into a desire to give. By doing that, a person aligns their frequency, so to speak, with the divine force.
And what blew my mind is that this isn't just an abstract moral philosophy or a nice sermon. They map this battle, this cosmic tension, onto the very shapes of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The texts we have go into incredible detail on the mystical significance of the letters. Let's walk the listener through a few of these because it shows how visually rich this theology is.
Let's start with the very first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. In Kabbalistic thought, Aleph isn't just the sound A. It represents the ultimate paradox of existence. Visually, it is constructed of an upper mark, a lower mark, and a diagonal line connecting them.
Like a bridge.
Yes, it symbolizes the union of opposites, the higher, infinite divine realities connecting with the lower, finite human realities. Through intense meditation, a mystic tries to reach the state of Aleph, where they realize God's absolute closeness and immanence in everything, while simultaneously understanding their own infinite distance and smallness compared to God.
Then you have the third letter, Gimel, and the shape of the letter itself actually tells a narrative story.
It does. The sages teach that the visual shape of the Gimel resembles a rich man with a foot extending forward, running. And who is he running toward? The next letter in the alphabet, the fourth letter, Delay, which visually represents a poor, bent-over man.
Oh, wow.
So Gimel symbolizes the active pursuit of doing good. It represents the act of giving charity, embodying Ashlag's ultimate desire to give. It encompasses the entire system of reward and punishment, running forward to bestow kindness.
And then there's Shin, the 21st letter. This one has such a powerful visual impact.
Shin is visually striking. It looks like a flame with three branches rising up from a single base. It represents symmetry, stability, and the consuming form of fire. Mystically, it connects to the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who form the foundation of the faith. And critically, the numerical value of Shin is 300.
Which perfectly transitions us into the math, because it's not just about meditating on the shape of the letters, it's about the mathematical equations behind them. This is the concept of gematria.
Gematria is the incredibly complex system of assigning numerical value to Hebrew letters to unlock hidden meanings, reveal secret connections between disparate words, and discover deeper truths encoded within the Torah. It operates on the premise that the text is divine, and therefore its mathematical structure is flawless and intentional.
And the texts reveal there isn't just one simple way to do the math. There are 4 distinct methods of gematria. I want to slow down and break these down because I struggled with this, and I want the listener to understand the sheer density and malleability of this interpretive system.
Let's go through them. The first is the absolute or normative value. This is the standard foundational method. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, up to Yud, which is 10. Then it goes by tens. Kuf is 100, Resh is 200, and so on.
Okay, that makes sense. Standard assignment. The second is ordinal value. This one is much simpler. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, so they are just numbered 1 through 22 in their strict alphabetical order. Aleph is 1, Tav is 22.
Correct. The third method is called reduced value. Here, you take the standard absolute value and you drop the zeros to reduce it to a single digit. So if a letter like Kuf is worth 100, its reduced value is 1. If Rash is worth 200, its reduced value is 2.
And the fourth is integral reduced value. This is the most complex. This is where you take an entire word, add up the standard values of all its letters to get a large sum. If that sum is more than 9, you keep adding the individual digits of that sum together until you finally get down to a single digit between 1 and 9.
Exactly. Let's look at the fascinating example provided in internal documents to see how this works in practice. We use the Hebrew word cheesed, which means loving kindness or grace. It's spelled with 3 letters, chet, samek, delay.
Okay, let's do the math on this together slowly. Using the first method, the absolute method, chet is 8, samek is 60, dalet is 4, so 8 plus 60 plus 4. That adds up to a total word value of 72. Now, if we apply the fourth method, the integral reduced method on that 72, we take the 7 and the 2, add them together, and we get 9.
Right. Now let's use the second method, the ordinal method, where we just use their place in the alphabet. Chet is the 8th letter. Samek is the 15th letter. Delay is the 4th letter. So 8 plus 15 plus 4 gives us a sum of 27. Now reduce that 27 by adding 2 plus 7, and again, you get 9.
Okay, let's try the third method, the reduced value method. We drop the zeros. Chet is 8. Samek is 60, so we drop the 0 and it becomes 6. Dalet is 4. So we add 8 plus 6 plus 4, which equals 18, and then we reduce that sum. 1 plus 8 equals 9.
Do you see the pattern? Regardless of which of the distinct mathematical methods you use to calculate the letters, the final integral reduced value of the word cheesed, loving kindness always perfectly comes back to the number 9. To a mystic, this isn't a coincidence. It is proof of divine architecture in the language itself.
It's like they are viewing the Torah not as a book of stories, but as the literal source code of the matrix. Every word is a mathematical equation hiding a cosmic truth. But here is my reaction, my skepticism to all this intense mathematics. If you can read the code 4 different ways, doesn't that inherently explain why we get wildly different real-world actions from the exact same text? If the code is that incredibly malleable, you can essentially build a mathematical justification for absolutely anything.
That is precisely the danger and the immense power of esoteric interpretation. When a text can be decoded mathematically to reveal hidden meanings that aren't apparent in the plain reading, the person doing the decoding holds immense, unquestionable power over their followers. They can extract a theology of absolute pacifism, or they can extract a theology that justifies a preemptive strike, and they can claim the math proves it.
And this manipulation of text, history, and language isn't just an internal debate within Judaism or Kabbalistic circles. It extends outward into the broader world. Which brings us to our final area of exploration today. How religious language and history are weaponized to build political alliances, or conversely, to persecute others.
Yes, we've looked at how theology shapes internal actions and underground plots, but now we need to look at how religious language is deployed as a blunt instrument in the public political sphere.
Let's start with a term that is absolutely ubiquitous in modern Western politics, Judeo-Christian. You hear politicians use it constantly. They talk about Judeo-Christian values to describe the foundation of Western civilization. But the historical record shows this term is not some ancient, immutable truth. It has a very specific, manufactured, modern origin.
It does. While the religions shared texts, historically they were largely antagonistic. The concept of a shared, unified Judeo-Christian tradition really only gained massive cultural traction in the 1930s and 40s in America. It was intentionally, deliberately deployed by influential Christians and Jews as a rhetorical shield to combat the terrifying rising tide of global anti-Semitism, fascism, and the threat of Nazi ideology. It was a way to say, we are in this together against a common secular evil.
And there's a famous, deeply tragic story that cemented this idea of interfaith unity in the American consciousness, the story of the sinking of the Dorchester during World War II.
The Dorchester was an American troop transport ship traversing the icy waters of the North Atlantic in February 1943. It was torpedoed by a German U-boat. As the ship was rapidly sinking in freezing waters, panic set in, and in the midst of that chaos, 4 military chaplains, A Catholic priest, a Jewish rabbi, and 2 Protestant ministers worked calmly to distribute life jackets. When they ran out, the 4 chaplains took off their own life belts and gave them to young soldiers who didn't have them.
They knowingly sealed their own fates.
Yes. The survivors reported looking back at the sinking ship and seeing the 4 chaplains standing together on the slanting deck. They linked arms, and they prayed together, each in their own tradition, as the ship went down.
It is an incredibly beautiful, heroic story of ultimate sacrifice. In 1948, the U.S. Post Office issued a commemorative stamp honoring them with the words, "Interfaith in Action." But fast forward to today, and the deployment of that term, Judeo-Christian, is facing massive, highly vocal backlash from multiple, very different sides of the political and theological spectrum.
Yes. The consensus is fractured. For instance, we see writers in traditional conservative Catholic publications like Crisis Magazine vehemently rejecting the label. Their theological argument is that Catholicism is complete on its own. It doesn't need a hyphenated identity. Furthermore, they argue that blending deep theological faith with a modern political catchphrase turns sacred worship into a cheap marketing plan. They deeply resent gluing their eternal theology onto a secular government's temporary political agenda.
And from a completely different angle on the political spectrum, critics point out that the term Judeo-Christian is now frequently used not as a shield against bigotry, but as an exclusionary vector for Islamophobia. It's used by politicians to draw a hard demographic line in the sand. We are Judeo-Christian, we belong here, these are our values, and they, usually pointing to Muslim immigrants, are outside of that tradition and incompatible with our society.
It perfectly illustrates how a phrase invented with the noble intention to create inclusion and fight fascism can be repurposed decades later as a rhetorical tool for political exclusion and boundary drawing.
But the weaponization of language goes back much further than the 1940s, and with much, much darker consequences. Let's look at the historical weaponization of a highly inflammatory phrase from the New Testament, the synagogue of Satan.
This phrase appears in the book of Revelation, specifically in chapters 2 and 3. And for centuries, throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, it has been used by anti-Semites as a blanket, devastating defamation of the Jewish people, suggesting that they are engaged in literal devil worship.
But the historical evidence reveals a completely different, highly localized, and deeply political context for that phrase that has nothing to do with demonic rituals.
Exactly. You have to look at the socio-political reality of the first century Roman Empire. The letters in Revelation were written to early, struggling communities of believers in specific cities in Asia Minor, like Smyrna and Philadelphia. At that time, the Roman government required all subjects to participate in the imperial cult, meaning you had to offer a sacrifice or burn incense to worship the Roman emperor as a god. It was a loyalty test.
But the Jewish community, because of their long history and recognized angel status, had a hard-won historical legal exemption from this requirement. They didn't have to worship the emperor.
Right. But the early Christian movement, which started as a Jewish sect, was increasingly bringing in non-Jewish Gentile converts. These new Christians refused to worship the emperor, claiming the same monotheistic exemption.
But the Romans looked at these non-Jews and said, "You aren't Jewish, you don't get the exemption, burn the incense."
Precisely. So what the historical context strongly suggests is that local Jewish synagogue leaders in these specific cities, acting in the interest of self-preservation to protect their own fragile legal status, went to the Roman magistrates. They acted as informers. They clarified to the Romans that these new troublemaking Christian believers were not actually part of the recognized Jewish community and therefore were not covered by the exemption, leaving them subject to Roman law, arrest, and violent persecution.
They gave the Romans a list of names to save their own community.
Right. And here's the linguistic key. The Hebrew word Satan does not originally mean a red guy with a pitchfork. It literally translates to accuser or adversary in a legal sense. So when the author of Revelation bitterly refers to the synagogue of Satan, it is almost certainly a localized political critique referring to those specific synagogue leaders who acted as accusers or informers, handing fellow believers over to the Roman authorities.
But stripped of that highly localized first-century political context, the phrase became a free-floating, lethal theological weapon for 2 millennia. And we see the ultimate terrifying example of how theological weaponization functions in the 1240 Paris trial.
The Paris trial is a devastating historical case study in what happens when internal texts are weaponized by the state. It was instigated by a man named Nicholas Donin, who was a Jewish convert to Christianity, and he eventually became a Franciscan friar. Donin traveled to Rome and submitted a formal list of 35 severe charges against the Talmud directly to Pope Gregory IX.
And because Donin had been rigorously trained in a yeshiva before his conversion, he knew the Talmud intimately. He knew exactly how to weaponize its complexities.
He did. He understood that the Talmud is a massive, sprawling record of centuries of debate. He took Agadic material, which is the folklore, the wild parables, the hypotheticals, and the non-legal, often highly metaphorical discussions in the Talmud, and presented them entirely out of context to the Christian authorities. He accused the Talmud of containing absurd irrationalities, offensive anthropomorphic representations of God, and most dangerously, hidden blasphemies against Jesus and Mary.
The Pope was enraged and ordered the confiscation of Jewish books across Europe. The result in France was a massive public trial where leading rabbis were forced to stand and defend their sacred texts against a completely hostile, predetermined Christian court. And the tragic, heartbreaking outcome was the public burning of massive cartloads of handwritten, irreplaceable Talmudic manuscripts at the stake in the center of Paris.
It was a catastrophic loss of cultural and religious heritage. Donin used his inside knowledge of the internal text to deliberately trigger the coercive, violent power of the state against his former community. It's the ultimate example of how taking a complex text out of its internal, conversational, interpretive framework and placing it in a hostile, literal framework can result in cultural devastation.
So when we look at Nicholas Donin in the 13th century selectively quoting the Talmud to the Pope to incite a book burning, or politicians today using Judeo-Christian as a wedge issue to exclude immigrants, or ancient texts about Amalek being used to justify violence in modern conflicts, are we just seeing the exact same tactic repeated over and over through history? Is theological language just the ultimate, unarguable political weapon?
It is uniquely, dangerously powerful because it claims a mandate that is higher than human reason, higher than diplomacy, and higher than secular law. When you argue regular politics, you are arguing about finite resources, tax rates, borders, and pragmatism. There is room for compromise. But when you argue theology in the political sphere, you are arguing about absolute eternal truth, the will of the Creator, and the eternal fate of the soul. That kind of leverage is incredibly difficult, almost impossible, for a secular system to counter.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this entire deep dive. We've covered a massive, intense amount of ground today. We started with a literal red cow flown from Texas, sitting on a wood pyre in Samaria, being closely inspected for a single white hair to either trigger or delay a prophetic, world-altering timeline. We ventured into the deeply mystical minds of the Jewish underground in the 1980s, who sincerely believed they could force God's hand and bring the Messiah by using dynamite to shatter cosmic husks on the Temple Mount.
We explored how the ancient biblical concept of Amalek is used today to define an eternal, unredeemable ideological enemy. And we contrasted that with Martin Luther King Jr.'s beautiful, pacifist vision of an interconnected universe, a single garment of destiny. We saw how deeply held religious beliefs lead groups like the Neturei Karta to completely, publicly reject the secular state that claims to protect them.
We did the math on the Hebrew alphabet to see how Kabbalists decode the universe, trying to transform the ego's desire to receive into the divine desire to give. And finally, we saw how deeply powerful words like Judeo-Christian and synagogue of Satan are systematically stripped of their original historical context and wielded as blunt political bludgeons.
The overarching takeaway from all of this research is that these texts, these ancient doctrines, and these incredibly dense mystical interpretations are not just dusty relics confined to archives or theology classrooms. They are active, vibrating wires in the modern world. They are the living, breathing blueprints that different factions are actively using right now to build entirely different, often violently colliding worlds.
If you're listening to this in a secular Western country, you are used to the idea that politicians and leaders compromise. You give a little ground, you get a little funding. But imagine trying to negotiate your city's zoning laws with someone who believes a specific building is literally feeding cosmic demons. That's the translation gap we're dealing with globally, which leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder. Throughout this deep dive, we've discussed institutional opacity, how groups use secret knowledge, hidden prophecies, or deeply layered mystical interpretations to justify their real-world, highly impactful actions. But what happens when the secular world governments, international diplomats, the UN, international courts, tries to negotiate with or govern these ideologically driven groups? A secular government fundamentally relies on compromise to function. It relies on splitting the difference, on material outcomes, on giving up a piece of land in exchange for peace, or trading resources for security guarantees. But how can a secular entity ever successfully negotiate with an institution or a movement whose primary, unyielding leverage is a divine, unalterable mandate? If a group genuinely believes their actions are dictated by the absolute perfect will of God or the mathematically certain structure of the cosmos, compromise isn't just difficult. Compromise is a literal theological failure. It is a sin. How do you sit across a diplomatic negotiating table and ask for a compromise from someone whose negotiation manual was written by God?
It is the geopolitical equivalent of trying to read an X-ray when the machine itself is fundamentally broken. The tools of secular diplomacy just bounce off the armor of absolute belief. You are staring deep into the diagnostic muddy waters, and there are no easy answers.
The muddy waters, indeed. It changes how you look at every headline. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care.